Her name was Elena Marquez, and for as long as she could remember, the world around her had measured her by doubt. She grew up in a small town where whispers traveled faster than truth, where people nodded politely but rarely believed a young woman when she said she wanted to serve her country. And yet, there she was, years later, in the desert heat with sand grinding into her boots and the weight of a rifle pressed against her shoulder, proof that determination could carry a person further than anyone expected. The air that day was dry, sharp, and heavy with the smell of burning diesel. Her unit had set up near a ridge, their vehicles lined in uneven rows, their helmets dusted in the ochre of foreign soil. To the others, she was still something of an outsider, respected enough to stand beside them, but not quite trusted in the way brothers in arms trusted each other. Elena had grown used to the sidelong glances, the hesitation in their voices when orders passed down the line. She carried the weight of every doubt, but instead of letting it break her, she let it forge her resolve. At night, when the camp grew quiet, she would lie awake listening to the distant thrum of engines and the hushed chatter of men who thought she was asleep. They spoke about her like she wasn't there. Some questioned her endurance, others wondered how long she'd last. Their words stung, but in that sting, Elena found fuel. Her silence became her strength, her resolve a shield. She remembered one evening when the desert sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. Elena sat alone, cleaning her rifle. Her hands moved with the precision of ritual, oiling, wiping, reassembling. The weapon was more than steel and scope. It was the one constant in a world that had given her nothing easily. Each piece she handled felt like a vow she had made to herself, to stand, to endure, to protect. The first time she saw him, the SEAL they all looked up to, he carried himself like someone carved out of discipline and storms. His name was never spoken with anything less than reverence. His uniform was worn, his jaw rough with days-old stubble, his eyes sharp enough to cut through hesitation. He didn't look at her like the others did. He studied her as though he were measuring something deeper, searching for the truth in the quiet way she moved. Their paths didn't cross much in those early weeks, but she could feel his presence in the way the others shifted when he entered a space. They trusted him without question. They would follow him into fire. And Elena, though she wouldn't admit it, longed for someone to look at her with even a fraction of that trust. One night, as the wind swept fine dust into every crease of her uniform, Elena found herself staring up at the stars. They glittered above like shards of glass scattered across black velvet, cold and unreachable. She thought of home, of the people who once told her she was chasing something impossible. She thought of her mother's tired hands, her father's silence, the weight of proving not only them wrong, but herself right. Her breath came slow, her chest rising against the ache that lived there. She closed her eyes and let the sound of distant footsteps drift closer, the crunch of boots on gravel, steady and unhurried. It was him, the SEAL, though she didn't turn to meet his gaze. He stopped beside her, looking out at the same horizon, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, his voice cut through the quiet, low and rough, shaped by years of command. "You carry yourself like someone who's been carrying more than just gear." She didn't answer, not at first. Words seemed fragile against the truth that pulsed in her chest. Instead, she drew in a breath, feeling the weight of it settle. "I carry what I have to," she said at last, her voice steady. He nodded, not pressing her further, as though that single sentence told him everything he needed to know. Then he walked away, leaving behind only the faint scent of dust and sweat, and something else, acknowledgement. That night, Elena lay awake with her eyes open, tracing the lines of the tent above her. The words replayed in her mind, not because they were grand, but because they carried a rare kind of recognition. It was the first time someone had seen her beyond the doubts, beyond the uniform, beyond the whispers. And though nothing else had changed, though the others would still question, though the road ahead would still be steep, something inside her shifted. It was small, fragile, but it was there. The seed of trust, waiting for the storm that would test whether it could survive. Elena pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the quiet drum of her heartbeat, and let the night carry her into sleep. Somewhere in that darkness, between the silence and the stars, a truth was beginning to take shape, one that would not only demand her strength, but prove it in ways no one could ignore. The morning came sharp and merciless, the desert sun climbing like a hammer above the horizon. Heat pressed down on the camp long before breakfast rations were opened, clinging to every surface, searing every breath. Elena laced her boots with practiced motions, the coarse laces scraping her calloused fingers. Around her, the others moved in clusters, joking, cursing, preparing. She did the same, though her silence set her apart. Orders had arrived at dawn, a patrol through the ridges where whispers of enemy movement had lingered for days. It was routine, the kind of mission that blurred into countless others, but Elena felt a heaviness in her chest, as though something in the air carried warning. She shouldered her rifle, the weight both familiar and grounding, and followed the line of soldiers toward the waiting vehicles. The convoy rumbled across the uneven ground, engines growling against the silence of the open desert. Elena sat pressed against the window of the armored vehicle, her gaze fixed on the shifting landscape outside, rock and dust, endless and unforgiving. She tried to focus on the rhythm of the wheels, the metallic clink of gear, but her mind slipped elsewhere. She thought of home again, of the way her town's streets had smelled of rain and soil after a storm, of the tiny porch where she once sat with her mother, watching lightning split the sky. Those memories seemed impossibly far, like echoes from another life. The ridge loomed ahead, jagged and watchful. As they disembarked, boots crunching against gravel, the silence deepened. No birds, no movement, only wind dragging sand across stone. The seal was at the front, scanning with eyes that missed nothing. His presence radiated calm, the kind that steadied the nerves of those around him. Elena, a few steps behind, kept her rifle ready, her senses sharpened by an unease she couldn't name. They moved in a staggered line, weaving through boulders and shadows. Each sound magnified, the scrape of metal, the shuffle of boots, the hiss of wind against rock. Elena's throat tightened as her ears caught something beneath it all, a faint click, unnatural and deliberate. Her body tensed, breath caught in her chest. Then it happened. The ground erupted in a violent roar. Dust and fire swallowed the air as a blast tore through the ridge, flinging bodies and shrapnel into chaos. Elena was thrown to the ground, her helmet slamming against rock, ears ringing with the concussive force. For a moment, the world fractured into silence, broken only by the frantic thud of her heart. When sound returned, it was sharp and unrelenting, shouts, gunfire, the scream of bullets carving air. Enemy fighters emerged from hidden crevices, their rifles spitting fire. The patrol scrambled for cover, returning fire in bursts that echoed off stone. Elena's hands moved instinctively, her rifle pressed to her shoulder, her breath steadying as she searched for targets. Dust stung her eyes, her lungs burned, but her training held. Beside her, one of the younger soldiers cried out, clutching his leg where shrapnel had torn through. Elena dragged him behind a rock, pressing her hand to the wound, her other hand still gripping her weapon. The boy's eyes were wide with panic, but she met his gaze with steady resolve. "Breathe. You're still here," she told him, voice calm despite the storm raging around them. The SEAL's voice cut through the chaos, low but commanding, rallying the team, directing fire. Bullets chipped stone inches from Elena's head, but she did not flinch. Her world narrowed to the weight of the rifle, the rhythm of breath, the determination not to falter. It was in that firestorm that the unspoken truths began to shift. She felt it in the way the SEAL glanced toward her, not with doubt, but recognition. She saw it in the way the others mirrored her movements, trusting her cover fire, leaning on her steadiness. Trust, fragile and long denied, was being forged in the crucible of battle. Minutes felt like hours. The fight raged until, slowly, silence began to reclaim the ridge. The last echo of gunfire faded, leaving behind only the rasp of labored breathing and the acrid scent of burned powder. Bodies, friend and foe alike, lay across the stones. The wounded moaned, the medics rushed, and the dust finally began to settle. Elena lowered her rifle, her arms trembling with exhaustion. Her ears still rang, her skin coated in grit, but she stood. Around her, the eyes that met hers were changed. No words passed, no grand declarations were made, but she felt it, the weight of doubt easing, replaced by something far rarer. As the sun sank lower, painting the horizon in fire and gold, Elena found a quiet corner near the vehicles. She sank to the ground, leaning against the steel, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Her hands trembled now that the danger had passed, and she pressed them into her knees to steady herself. The seal approached, his shadow stretching long in the dying light. He crouched beside her, his gaze level, his rifle still slung across his chest. For a moment, he said nothing, just studied her with the same measured calm he had carried into battle. Then, with a quiet certainty, he spoke. "You held the line." Elena met his eyes, her throat tight, words caught somewhere between disbelief and relief. She didn't need to answer. His voice carried no judgment, no hesitation, only truth. And in that truth, for the first time, she felt something new stirring within her. Not the burden of proving herself, but the quiet, undeniable beginning of being trusted. The days after the ambush passed in a blur of exhaustion and silence. Dust lingered in the air long after the ridge had grown quiet, and though the unit carried on with their duties, a subtle shift had taken root among them. They spoke to her differently now, their eyes steady when they met hers. Trust did not arrive with words or applause. It lived in the pauses, in the way they no longer second-guessed her presence at their side. But it was not victory that filled her thoughts at night. It was the sound of the blast, the shouts, the young soldier's wide eyes as she pressed her hand against his bleeding leg. The images returned when she closed her own eyes, sharp and unforgiving. In the silence of the tent, Elena often lay awake, her heartbeat a restless drum against the thin canvas walls. The seal had not said more than those 3 words, "You held the line," but they stayed with her like an ember glowing deep inside. He carried himself as he always had, unshaken and resolute, but she noticed how often his gaze found her now, assessing, measuring, and perhaps trusting. It was on a night patrol that the turning point came. The moon was thin, barely more than a silver sliver above the desert. The world was cast in shadows, the ridge lines etched like scars against the horizon. Their boots whispered over the sand, rifles raised, every step careful. The air was too still, and Elena felt the weight of it pressing against her chest, as though the night itself was holding its breath. Then the crack of gunfire split the silence. Bullets ripped through the dark, flashes sparking from hidden positions. Shouts erupted, orders cut through the chaos, and once again the world was fire and dust. Elena dropped behind cover, her rifle pressed tight to her shoulder. Her breath came steady despite the storm, her finger moving with precision as she returned fire. To her right, the seal crouched low, scanning the ridgeline through a scope. His movements were fluid, practiced, yet she caught the moment his weapon jammed, the metallic click ringing hollow. In that instant, the battle seemed to fold inward. The enemy pressed closer, their fire sharp and unrelenting. Without hesitation, Elena shifted. Her hands moved faster than thought, her own rifle braced against the rock, muzzle flashes slicing through the night as she covered his position. The seal struggled to clear the jam, his face set in grim focus, but for those seconds it was Elena's fire that kept the line from breaking. Her heart hammered, but her aim was steady, every shot carrying the weight of the trust she had fought so long to earn. Then his rifle clattered against the stone, useless. He turned toward her, and in the fleeting light of gunfire, their eyes met. No words passed, but something unspoken surged between them. Acknowledgement, trust, necessity. He reached across, pulling his sidearm, and with his other hand, he shoved his rifle toward her. "Take it," he barked, his voice low and certain. The weapon was heavier than hers, its scope sharper, its history etched in scratches and worn steel. Elena grasped it, her palms fitting against the grooves as though it had always been meant for her. She dropped flat against the rock, sighted through the scope, and let the world narrow into focus. Through the crosshairs, the enemy came into clarity, silhouettes against stone, the glint of weapons in the moonlight. She exhaled slowly, her finger tightening, and fired. One shot, then another. The recoil surged into her shoulder, but she did not falter. Around her, the night was alive with thunder, but inside, she felt only calm. Each round carried her deeper into a truth she had longed for. She was not an outsider, not a burden, not a whisper of doubt. She was here, holding the rifle that had never been freely given to anyone outside his trust. She was the line. The firefight stretched on, but something had changed. The unit moved with her. Their rhythm matched to hers. When at last the final echoes faded and silence reclaimed the ridge, Elena lowered the rifle, her chest heaving, sweat streaking her face beneath the helmet. The SEAL took it back with a nod, his expression unreadable, yet carrying something she had never seen before: respect, unguarded and complete. No one spoke as they regrouped, gathering the wounded, counting their numbers. But in the silence, Elena felt it settle inside her. The shift from being doubted to being trusted, not by accident, but by fire. Later, back at camp, as the stars stretched across the endless dark, Elena sat alone, her hands still tingling from the recoil, her ears still ringing with the memory of the shots. She thought of all the nights she had lain awake, wondering if she would ever be seen for who she truly was. And now, though no one had said it aloud, she knew the truth had arrived, not in gentle words, but in the rough steel of a rifle pressed into her hands in the darkest hour. Her breath slowed, her shoulders eased. She gazed up at the sky, the constellations scattered like fragments of old promises, and let a quiet strength wash through her. For the first time, she did not feel like she had to prove herself. The desert had a way of swallowing time. Days bled into nights, missions into memories, and somewhere in the dust and silence, Elena found herself changed. Not by ceremony or proclamation, but by the quiet recognition that lived in the eyes of those around her. Trust had settled into the unit like a steady heartbeat. Where once there had been sidelong glances, there was now a quiet certainty. She belonged. It was after another long patrol that Elena sat alone at the edge of camp, the glow of the fire flickering against her face. The others laughed quietly in a circle behind her, their voices soft against the hum of generators and the rustle of canvas in the wind. She listened without turning, letting their words wash over her. Once, their conversations had cut her, their doubts carried on the air. Now, their voices carried warmth, and in them she heard something new: acceptance. The SEAL passed by on his way to the perimeter, pausing as he often did. He didn't linger or intrude, but he gave a nod, firm and measured. It was not the nod of command, nor of courtesy. It was the nod of an equal. She returned it, her lips tugging into the faintest smile, and he moved on into the shadows. When the fire died low, she rose and wandered beyond the edge of camp. The night air was cool against her skin, carrying the faint scent of oil and sand. Above her, the stars sprawled in endless constellations, the same stars that had once watched her from the porch back home. She tilted her head back, letting the sight wash through her, and for the first time in months, she let her shoulders relax. The memories came, as they always did. Her father's silence, her mother's weary hands, the whispers of neighbors who had doubted her. She remembered the way they had dismissed her dreams, told her service was not for her, told her she would not last. Those words had been carved deep inside, sharp enough to follow her across oceans and deserts. But now, standing beneath the vast sweep of the sky, she realized those doubts had lost their hold. Her hands still trembled sometimes. Her nights were still broken by echoes of gunfire, the sudden rush of explosions replaying in her mind. Yet beneath all of it was something stronger, a foundation built in fire, a strength she had not known she carried. She closed her eyes, listening to the silence of the desert, and in it she heard the steady rhythm of her own breath. The days that followed were no easier. Missions came, the danger lingered, and the weight of war pressed down on all of them. But Elena moved through it differently now. When she shouldered her rifle, the men beside her no longer questioned whether she could hold the line. They knew. And when she caught the SEAL's gaze across the dust and smoke of battle, she saw something that anchored her, a respect earned not by words, but by action. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Elena sat with the younger soldier she had pulled to safety during the ambush. His leg was still wrapped in bandages, his movements slow but steady. He looked at her with quiet gratitude, his voice low when he spoke. "You saved me," he said simply. Elena shook her head. "We save each other," she answered. The boy nodded, but his eyes lingered on her, filled with something more than thanks. It was the same look she had once longed for, the silent acknowledgement that she was not invisible. In that moment, she felt the weight of what her journey had meant, not only for herself, but for those who watched, who learned from her presence. When sleep finally came that night, it carried her into dreams not of war, but of home. She saw her mother's tired smile, her father's quiet nod. She imagined walking those familiar streets again, not as the girl they doubted, but as the woman who had carried herself through fire. The war was not over. The road ahead would be long, marked with hardship and silence. But Elena no longer feared being unseen. She had been tested, and in that crucible she had found her place. As dawn broke, she stood once more, boots crunching against the gravel, rifle slung across her shoulder. The horizon stretched wide, painted in hues of gold and ash. She breathed in the morning air, cool and sharp, and let it fill her with calm. Today, she was not chasing proof, nor carrying the weight of others' doubt. She stood as herself, soldier, daughter, survivor. A woman who had been trusted when it mattered most. And though the world might never know her name, though her story might remain unwritten in the grand halls of history, Elena knew the truth. She carried it in her bones, in the scars on her skin, in the quiet strength that would guide her forward. She was no longer the woman they doubted. She was the woman who endured. The one who stood when silence pressed heavy. The one who proved, not with words, but with the steady pull of a trigger and the unyielding fire of her spirit. Under the rising sun, Elena allowed herself a small, steady smile. For the first time, it was not the past that defined her, nor the doubts of others. It was the hope of what came next. The desert had grown quieter in the weeks that followed, though quiet in war never meant peace. It was a pause, fragile and temporary, like breath held too long. The ridge where trust had been earned stood now as little more than scarred stone, the wind sweeping away blood and ash, but leaving memory etched into every crack. Elena carried those memories with her, tucked behind the calm of her gaze, heavy in the silence that followed her steps. She moved through camp with the same steady rhythm, her rifle always at her side. The others no longer questioned her presence. Their nods came without hesitation, their trust unspoken but firm. Yet with recognition came something unexpected, the weight of expectation. She felt it in the way they watched her when danger loomed, as though her steadiness had become a compass for them all. And though she bore it without complaint, in the stillness of night, she felt its weight pressing deeper than any armor. It was on a patrol at dusk when the silence shifted again. The horizon stretched wide, the sky painted in bruised purples and fading gold. Their boots moved across uneven ground, the crunch of gravel swallowed by the wind. Elena scanned the ridges, her eyes sharp, her breath calm. She had learned to trust that quiet hum in her chest, the intuition that had saved her before. Tonight it stirred again. The ambush came sudden, shouts, muzzle flashes tearing open the twilight. The team dropped for cover, their formation fracturing in the chaos. Elena pressed against the earth, dust filling her lungs as gunfire roared above. Her heart hammered, but her movements stayed deliberate, each shot precise, each breath measured. Around her, panic threatened to take hold, but she anchored herself to the rhythm of survival. Through the haze, she spotted the youngest of the unit pinned down, his body exposed to the line of fire. Without pause, Elena pushed forward, her knees scraping against stone, rifle pressed against her chest. She reached him just as a burst of bullets tore into the ground nearby, showering them both in dirt. Grabbing his vest, she dragged him into cover, her muscles burning, ears ringing with the nearness of death. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice calm against the storm. His eyes met hers, wide with fear, but her steadiness held him. She pushed her rifle into his hands for a moment, covering him as she scanned the ridge. The SEAL's silhouette was visible across the field, his command sharp, his presence immovable. Their eyes met briefly through the chaos, and Elena felt the silent thread of trust tighten between them. Minutes stretched into eternity before the firefight subsided, the enemy retreating into the shadows they had come from. The silence afterward was deafening, broken only by the hiss of radios and the ragged breath of survivors. Elena's arms trembled as she lowered her rifle, her chest heaving with exhaustion. But she stood, dirt streaking her face, her voice steady as she called for the medic. Back at camp, the boy she had pulled to safety sought her out. His voice was small, his words halting, but they carried the weight of truth. "I thought I was gone," he said. You pulled me back." Elena placed a hand on his shoulder, her palm rough against his trembling frame. "We don't leave each other behind," she said simply. That night, when the camp quieted and the stars reclaimed the sky, Elena sat alone once more. The rifle rested across her lap, cool against her skin, its weight both comfort and burden. She thought of the SEAL, of the moment he had given her his weapon, of the unspoken trust forged in battle. She thought of the boy whose life she had pulled from the fire, of the countless names and faces who carried each other through the storm. Her hands trembled again, not from fear but from the enormity of it all, the lives balanced on decisions made in split seconds, the quiet expectation that she would always hold the line. She pressed her palms together, steadying them, and lifted her gaze to the constellations above. She did not see herself as a hero. She was simply a soldier, carrying scars both visible and hidden. Yet beneath the weight, she felt something she had not before, a belonging that no one could take away. As dawn crept across the desert, painting the world in pale gold, Elena rose. Her shadows stretched long against the ground, her rifle slung across her shoulder. The day ahead promised no certainty, only the endless rhythm of duty. But within her, the silence was no longer heavy with doubt. It was filled with purpose. And in that purpose, she found peace. The desert gave way to silence once more, though it was a different silence than before. The air still smelled faintly of cordite, of dust disturbed by boots and bullets, yet there was a stillness that hinted at change. Elena stood at the edge of the camp at dawn, her shadow long, her breath visible in the coolness before the sun rose. The war had not ended, not in any official sense, but something within her had shifted. She could feel it, like a thread pulled loose, unraveling the old weight she had carried for so long. The camp stirred slowly awake. Radios crackled, tents rustled, and the low murmur of men returning to their routines filled the air. Elena walked among them, nodding at familiar faces, pausing when their eyes met hers. There was no need for words. Respect now flowed like an unspoken current, steady and quiet. She had become part of the fabric here, stitched into the lives of those who had once doubted her. And though she wore that acceptance with quiet dignity, she felt the fragile truth beneath it. Trust, once earned, must always be carried carefully. Later that morning, the SEAL sought her out. His presence was as steady as ever, his shoulders broad beneath his gear, his eyes sharp yet softened by something unspoken. He stopped a few feet away, rifle slung casually, and studied her for a moment before speaking. You kept that kid alive, he said simply. Elena looked down at her hands, still scratched from dragging the boy to safety. We keep each other alive, she replied. The seal gave a short nod, a faint smile crossing his face. It was the closest thing to gratitude he had ever offered aloud. And in that quiet exchange, Elena felt the weight of something larger than words, an acknowledgement that would stay with her long after the dust of this place settled. That night, the dreams returned. She lay in her cot, the camp dim and restless around her, and drifted into memories she had tried to bury. The echo of gunfire, the sharp scent of burning metal, the faces of those she could not save. Her body tensed in sleep, her breath shallow, until the memory of the boy's terrified eyes cut through. But unlike the dreams before, this one ended differently. She saw herself reaching him, pulling him to safety, and she woke with her hands unclenched, her chest steady. She sat up, staring at the canvas above, and realized something profound. She was no longer haunted only by loss. She was beginning to carry survival, too. Days turned to weeks. Missions came and went, each one blending into the next. The war was relentless, but so was resilience. Elena found herself standing taller, her voice carrying more weight when she spoke. She wasn't louder. She didn't need to be. But when she offered advice, men listened. When she took point, they followed. She was not just the woman with a rifle anymore. She was a soldier whose steadiness had become a beacon. On one of the quieter evenings, as the sky burned orange over the horizon, Elena walked the perimeter alone. The ground crunched beneath her boots, the desert wind tugged at her hair, and the silence felt alive with memory. She paused at a rise overlooking the endless expanse and let herself breathe deeply. For the first time in months, her chest did not ache with the weight of proving herself. She thought of home, the oak tree in her mother's yard, the worn porch steps, the sound of rain on the roof. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine returning there, not as the uncertain woman who had left, but as someone reshaped by fire. The thought both comforted and unsettled her. She wondered if the silence of home would feel like peace, or if it would carry the same heaviness that followed her here. A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. The young soldier, the one she had saved, stood a few steps away, hesitant. His face was still marked with youth, but his eyes carried something older now. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I just wanted you to know. I don't think I'd still be here if it weren't for you." Elena's chest tightened, her throat catching. She didn't see herself as a savior, but hearing the words from him, raw and unguarded, struck something deep within her. She placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and firm. "Then make it mean something," she told him softly. "Carry it forward." He nodded, his eyes shining, and walked away. Elena remained at the ridge, the desert stretching endlessly before her, her heart heavy yet unburdened in a way it had never been. As darkness folded over the horizon, stars pierced the sky one by one. She tilted her head back, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. The silence here would always remain, but it no longer felt like a weight pressing down. It had become a space, a wide, open space where memory and purpose could coexist. Elena closed her eyes and let the quiet settle. For the first time in a long while, it did not feel like absence. It felt like possibility.